Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Bryant and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide for a smooth recording. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on the 17th. That's next week on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Locating Records in Archives from Your Couch with Sarah Kathryn. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on duplicates in Family Tree Part 1, why they're there and how to find them. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history and discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton, Utah Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she is a regular contributor to the FamilySearch blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and summertime. And if Kathryn is ready, then we'll turn the time over to her.
Yep, I am ready. Bryant, thank you so much. So we're just going to share the screen here. Okay, well, everybody, welcome. It's so good to have you with us today for this webinar. And as I was preparing this webinar, you may notice that this is actually an update to a webinar that was done previously. And I was looking at the date and saw that this presentation was first given in 2014, if you could believe that. So it's been about 8 years. It's about time for an update. What is so interesting as I looked back on my kind of journey with duplicates was that at the time I first prepared the webinar or the presentation, I was very, very concerned about duplicates as a problem. I ran across them constantly in Family Tree. I saw that they caused issues for me and others. So that was kind of my focus at that time. But since that time, I've come to believe that there's a much more serious problem in Family Tree than duplicates. I still feel like duplicates are a challenge and are a problem, but I now believe that bad merges are probably a lot more serious than the problem of duplicates itself. And so I've kind of changed the focus on this presentation. So we're still going to talk about duplicates, but we're also going to pay more attention to how to prevent bad merges when we're evaluating duplicates. So with that said, let's dive into our little agenda here and see what we're going to be covering today. We're going to first talk about duplicates in Family Tree. What are they? Why are there so many? And why are they a problem? And then second, we'll talk about ways to find possible duplicates. And then finally, how can I tell if two possible duplicates really are duplicates? So what are duplicates in Family Tree? A lot of this might be basic to you who are viewing this webinar, but I like to go over it anyway just to make sure we're all on the same page. So in order to understand what a duplicate is in Family Tree, it's important to understand the goal of Family Tree, which is actually different than most other genealogy websites. The goal of Family Tree is one complete, accurate record for each person who has lived on the earth, linked to other records by correct relationships. So you probably are aware that, for instance, if you go to Ancestry.com or different websites like that, people can have their own private trees. That's actually not the case on Family Tree. Instead, we are all working on one shared tree. So to get us all on the same page, what is a duplicate in Family Tree? There's a really simple definition, and basically it's that it is a record in Family Tree that represents the same human being as another record. So going back to what I said earlier, how a picture is worth 1,000 words, I like things visual because then I feel like I grasp them better. So we're looking at a duplicate, a set of duplicates here on the screen for Phoebe Ann Gunton. And you notice that they've got different PIDs. So the one on the left ends in G9P. The one on the right ends in GHW. So that indicates that we've got two records, two distinct records in Family Tree. But as you look at the information, the name is exactly the same. The christening information is exactly the same. As we scroll down on the page, we look at the family information and we see that the parents are exactly the same, an unknown father and a mother with the same name as Phoebe. And then finally, if we get into the changelog, we see that the changelog is almost identical. About the only difference is that one or two of the contribution dates are different, and then also the PIDs are different. But other than that, the information is identical. And so this is a kind of a textbook example, right, of a duplicate. It's two records that are just so clearly meant to represent the same person. So that's what we mean when we talk about a duplicate in Family Tree. You might then be asking the question, how did we get so many? And there's a good explanation for that. In order to understand why there's so many duplicates in Family Tree, it helps to understand where the data came from. And there are three main sources. The original source, before it was even called Family Tree, was a collection of temple ordinances done by the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it also included extracted vital records. In case you're not familiar with extracted records, the extraction program was just the precursor to the indexing program, but it was basically the same thing, where volunteers would write down information about births, marriages, and deaths from church and government records. And then those were put eventually into Family Tree. They were put into different predecessors, of course, but at this point, they all ended up in Family Tree. So then we've got church membership records, and by church I mean Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The information from members of the church is fed into Family Tree when the person passes away. So once a person has died, if they were a member of the church, then their information will show up in Family Tree. Then finally, the last group, or the last contribution, if you will, to the data in Family Tree is just by regular users like you and me. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of overlap between those three sources. So you can notice, for instance, suppose that there was an early member of the Church of Jesus Christ who lived in England, and they came over and settled in the Salt Lake Valley. Well, they could also have an extracted record in, say, an English parish register. So duplicate records could end up in Family Tree that way. Then also users of Family Tree accidentally or intentionally add duplicates. This actually surprised me at first when I found that there were people intentionally adding duplicates, but a lot of times it's because they don't understand that Family Tree is a shared tree where we're all working on one tree, and they're still kind of on the old my tree, your tree model. And then I actually have talked to people who do add duplicates intentionally because they feel like somehow that's going to make um, research easier, but that's actually not the purpose of Family Tree. We're not wanting to add duplicates on purpose, because remember, we're trying to build a tree with just one record for every human being who's lived on the earth. So why are duplicates a problem? That might maybe the people who are adding duplicates would ask this question. They would maybe not see it as a big deal, but let's look at why duplicates are a problem. Duplicate records can cause confusion. They can cause duplicate research. For example, suppose that there are two duplicates and the system does not recognize them. I'm working on one, you're working on the other. Well, then if we don't know that, we're doing duplicate research. Not only that, it can lead to even more duplicates. Using that example that I just gave, suppose that I add somebody and then I add all their kids, not realizing that you added the same person and you're adding all their kids. So duplicates just tend to snowball. They result in even more duplicates. It can result in duplicate temple work. And then finally, really the bottom line is it just results in a lot of wasted time and effort. And I don't know about you folks, but I'm guessing that most of us don't enjoy wasting time and effort. So if there's a good way to avoid that, let's do it. So how can I find duplicates in Family Tree? There are basically two ways to find duplicates. There are automated ways and there are manual ways, and we're going to look at examples of each one. I did want to point out that it's not either or, so they're not mutually exclusive. Honestly, I usually use both methods when I'm trying to determine whether somebody has a duplicate in Family Tree. So a combination of both methods can be helpful. So here's an example of method number one. I would imagine that probably most of us are familiar with this, and that is the possible duplicates function on the person page. It appears in two places. It appears in the research help box, and then it also appears in the tools section. And I like the tools section because it tells you immediately how many possible duplicates you're dealing with. So that's one way that the system will find possible duplicates for you. The other method is actually when you're adding people. So in this example, I had found a daughter of this Harry Chambers and Annie Raines, and her name was Jane Annie Chambers. And so I wanted to add her. So I completed the add form with her name and her information, and then I clicked next. And the system automatically searched for duplicates. I didn't even have to do anything. It just said, hey, you're trying to add this person. We think she may already be in Family Tree, so you ought to check out these two people. And as it turned out, one of them was a duplicate for her. So strictly speaking, this is finding duplicates for somebody you're thinking of adding. So really what it's doing is preventing another duplicate. But that's important. That's part of the process of avoiding duplication. So those are the two automated methods. I did want to comment on how these automated methods work, because sometimes I think there's a bit of confusion about that, understandably. So basically, the automated searches in Family Tree work by comparing two records. If the records have a lot of information in common, they're flagged as possible duplicates. So here's an example. You see the record on the left is for John Bescovy, christened in 18th of March, 1860 in Lincoln, and he's the son of John and Eleanor. If you look at the record on the right, it's almost identical, except that the month is spelled out and there's a variation in the mother's spelling of the mother's name. But it's so obvious to us that that's a duplicate record, right? It represents the same person. And Family Tree looks at that, and it also computes that it represents the same person because it has such a high percentage of common information, of information in common between those two records. Well, let's look at one that isn't quite so obvious. So if there's not as much information in common, then at a certain threshold, Family Tree will no longer suggest that record is a duplicate. So let's look at this one. We've got the same John Bescovy, but is this record a duplicate? Well, his name is spelled a little bit differently. The year is off a little bit. The country is very broad compared to the original data, or excuse me, I should say compared to the other data. And then it only has a father and no mother. Well, as it happens, because of doing research, I know that these two individuals are the same, but would Family Tree consider them to be the same? Possibly not. And the reason I'm not going to say absolutely is that Family Tree keeps refining their duplicate algorithms. So the point here is not these specific examples. The point is that if there's lots of information in common, Family Tree will flag it as a duplicate. If there's not as much in common, Family Tree may not flag it as a duplicate. So now let's talk about the manual methods. Really, the primary manual method is to use the find function. So I'd like to walk through an example that illustrates that. So we're looking at Mary Jane Hibbert, and as you see over here, no possible duplicates were found by Family Tree. Let's take a look at the information that Family Tree would have used to search for a possible duplicate. Basically, it would have used her name and it would have used her birth and christening information. So we've got 1855 in Gorton, Lancashire. Then it also would have used the family members. It would have used the fact that there's no spouse, and it would have used these parents. So the duplicate search looked in Family Tree and didn't find a record that was similar with this information, and so it did not flag any duplicate. Well, as I did research on this Mary Jane Hibbert, guess what I found? She married James Mostyn, and it had her dad in on it. It had the right occupation. It was in the right location. And so I was confident that this was really her husband. We really had found James Mostyn. And then as I continued researching, and I have simplified this for the sake of example, so we're only going to look at one census, but in the 1911, they've got 3 children, Florence, Bertha, and Elsie, and they're all born in Manchester, Lancashire. Well, based on experience with English records at this time period, I strongly suspected that there might be either a marriage record for them or a christening records for the children that would come up, and all of those would contain duplicates for Mary Jane, even though no duplicates were flagged from that original record. So I decided to do a manual find, and I decided to focus on the kids and not the marriage. And so to do a search for the children, I left the first name blank, filled out the last name, put in the birthplace, put in a reasonable birth year. Birth year for the kids. The couple got married in 83, and I thought, let's just take them up to 1900. That's 17 years, about 20 years, a good span for the woman to be having children. And then for the parents, I put James Mostyn as the father, and then I only put Mary Jane as the mother. And the reason for that is that in England at that time, the mother's maiden name was rarely put on the child's christening record. Once in a while it was for nonconformist records, but most of the time it would either not list any surname or it would list her married surname. And so that's how I filled out the search. And then I clicked find, and look what came up. Florence, Elsie, and Bertha, those 3 children from the 1911 census. So it turns out that in addition to the original record we had for Mary Jane Hibbert, she's in here 3 additional times at least that I found so far. So I guess those aren't duplicates, those are quadruplicates, right? So we've got her in here additional times, and we would need to merge those records. So manual finding is generally done by using the find function. But I wanted to point out a couple of several bonus, what would you call them? They're methods by which you could observe duplicates. It's not as if you would have intentionally started to search for them, but there are times where if you're observant, you can see duplicates in Family Tree that the system doesn't catch. Let's look at some examples. Oh, I forgot. Sorry, you guys. Let's go through this little explanation here. So you may be asking, okay, since those people, those Mary Janes, those 4 Mary Janes were the same person, why did FamilySearch not realize that? Well, look what FamilySearch had to go on. For record 1, we had Mary Jane Hibbert, and there's the PID. We had a birth in Gorton, Lancashire, and we had parents. Record 2, we had Mary Jane, and I just chose one of the 3 records. I chose the one with the incorrect surname. And this is one thing that you might find with indexed records, which I feel is unfortunate, is that sometimes people will index the married name, and that just makes it harder to find the duplicate, because the rule in Family Tree is that you should use the woman's maiden name, at least in cultures where women change their name upon marriage. So we had Mary Jane here with her incorrect married name. And then we had nothing by way of birth, nothing by way of parents, and we only had a spouse and child. So basically, the only thing in common between those 2 records was Mary Jane's name, and that was it. So that was not enough for Family Tree to consider those 2 records duplicates, even though a human being doing just even a slight bit of research, that probably took me 10 minutes to do that research, but it was enough for me to identify that these people were duplicates. Okay, so let's talk about these bonus methods for finding duplicates in Family Tree. In this particular case, I was looking for a duplicate for Alice Brown, and I found a record for her up here. But what do you notice on this page? I'm not going to open up the chat this time. We often will do that, but this one's a pretty quick one. So you probably notice that there is an Ivy Alice Brown down here that's got exactly the same christening record or christening information and exactly the same parents. So this is very likely a duplicate record, and possibly even a relation to my original Alice that I was searching for. So at least that is something worth checking into. And then if that is a duplicate, I can remove 3 duplicates from the system. I can merge Ivy and I can merge both of her parents. So when you're looking at search results, as you scan those, just kind of keep your eyes open and you may find some duplicates that you weren't even looking for. Bonus method number 2 is when you're looking at the family section of somebody's person page. Look at this and tell me what duplicates, or actually just, again, because of time, we won't open up the chat on this particular example, but just look at, oh dear, I did that too fast, sorry, get back. Okay, so look at this example and tell me what, or think in your mind, where are the duplicates here? Yeah, sorry, I kind of ruined that, right? Stole the thunder. But we've got 4 different people named Edward Whitby here. We've got 3 kids born the same year. And as you look at those, probably they're the same person. We would want to check those out. But the Edward Whitby above, even though he's got the same name, he's not the same person, obviously, because he both was born and died in 1814. It was a practice in England at that time to name a child after a deceased older sibling. So you do have to be careful. You can't just automatically assume that children born with the same name and close to the same year in the same family are the same, because they may not be. One may be an older sibling that died. But it's worth checking out. So this is another bonus method where you may be able to identify possible duplicates. Okay, bonus method number 3 is when you're attaching a source from historical records and it comes up with possible matches. It's not a guarantee, but again, it's worth checking into. These 2 Margaret Pringles may actually be the same person. Bonus method number 4 is when you're trying to attach a source to somebody and you get in there and you see that on the other relatives, it's already attached to somebody else. So I was here trying to attach a record, I think it was to the mom, but then it showed that the source was already attached to the child and to the father, to a different child and a different father. So this says to me, you notice that this one, it's already attached to somebody ending in B76. I was trying to attach it to someone ending in GP2. So probably the B76 and the GP2 are duplicates. At least they are worth checking out. Okay, so those were the bonus methods. Now let's walk through probably what I consider now the most important part of this presentation, and that is once you've found some possible duplicates, how do you tell if they really are duplicates? So there are several possible scenarios that we're going to run into when we're evaluating duplicates. There will be some slam dunks, like that obvious duplicate that we looked at the very beginning with Phoebe Ann Gunton. But sometimes it's not as easy to tell. There will be times when you will find records that appear to be duplicates, but they aren't. And there will be times that you will find records that don't appear to be duplicates, but they are. So I want to walk through an example of each one of those. And in each case, FamilySearch or Family Tree had identified a potential duplicate. And in one case, it turned out to be one. And in another case, it turned out not to be one. So let's look at both those examples. So this is one where a possible duplicate is actually not a true duplicate. This is for Samuel Hibbert, and the system identified this possible duplicate ending in MHJ. So I click on that, and it gives me the opportunity to review the merge. And so I click on that, and look what I get. I get two families that really look to be pretty different. But just to be careful, we actually need to look at the evidence. So in the record on the right has completely different spouses and children from the record on the left. Not only that, we look at the range of the children, and the last known child was born in 1867 for this family on the right. But the first known child was born in 68. So actually, it is possible that this Samuel Hibbert married a different Elizabeth Barker, perhaps after his first wife died. This was the last child of the first wife. Then the next child was the first child of the second wife. That's a possibility. We actually cannot tell from this screen. And I think that is so important to point out, because so many times we just assume or take for granted that we've got all the information that we need on the merge screen, and that's actually not true. In fact, most of the time I find that I do not have the information I need on the merge screen to tell whether I really should merge. Instead, I've got to do a little bit of extra research. So let's do a little bit of extra research. I looked through these children, and they are all born in Gorton, Lancashire. And all of these children are born in Salford, Lancashire. Now, it's not that far apart, relatively speaking. So it is possible that Samuel, after this wife died, just speaking theoretically, if this wife died, that he could have married another woman and they could have moved. That could happen. We don't know yet. So we got to do a little more digging. Well, what we find out from the census is that this family on the right lived in Gorton from 1851 clear until 1891, way after these kids were born. And not only did they live in the same parish, they actually lived in the same house. And so it would be just almost impossible to think that they would have, that they would have left their home, gone over here, had these two children, and then come back to their house at Gorton. I guess it's possible, but it's just so unlikely. But if we look in the census, we find the clincher, and that is that both families appear separately in the 1871 census. So that was absolute proof that for these two people, we want to mark them not a match. These Samuel Hibberts are absolutely not the same person, even though FamilySearch suggested them as a possible duplicate. And again, we don't want to criticize Family Tree for that. That's not a failing of Family Tree. Family Tree, again, remember, it's mathematical. They look at the percentage of information that is the same between two records. If it's a high percentage, they'll flag it as a possible duplicate. If it's a low percentage, they won't. So that's why we, as users of Family Tree, still need to do our due diligence. Okay, let's look at an unlikely duplicate that is a true duplicate. So here we've got Eliza Goodwin, and Family Tree is suggesting a possible duplicate for her. So once again, we click her, we go into the merge screen that allows us to compare the information. Well, look right away what we've got here. We've got conflicting information. In fact, Family Tree helped us out by pointing out, hey, we've got some indications that these might not be the same person. So they're born in different years and they're born in different states. Then we get to, and sorry, I couldn't fit it all on the same screen. This is actually part of the same screen, but we scroll down and we see that Eliza Goodman on the right, the record that we are going to keep if we were to do a merge, has a husband of Solomon Howard and children of Lucy and Solomon Clarence. Whereas Eliza on the left has a completely different spouse, completely different children, and completely different parents. Well, as it turns out, Charles, just again, this was maybe 10 minutes worth of research. This wasn't hours and hours or months and months or whatever. Charles is her first husband. The same woman who married this Charles Varian married Solomon Howard. So that was evidence that they were the same people. And then also the children are spaced adequately so that it fits. And I discovered that the Eliza Goodman who married Solomon was the daughter of this Oliver and Sophia, just as was the Eliza Goodwin who married Charles. So that gave us the proof that we needed, that even though this information seems to indicate they might not be the same person, just checking historical records showed us that they actually were. So you may be saying, well, what about that conflicting information? And that's a really good question. Look at this information a little more closely, and you see that the person who added it was just estimating. So they estimated about 1804, and they estimated of Cincinnati. And the reason they did that was because when Eliza married Solomon, they lived in Ohio. They lived, and actually, I don't remember if they lived in Cincinnati. I think they might have been married there, but they definitely lived in Ohio. And so that's why the person who added the record put that as an of birthplace, because at that point they hadn't found the right birthplace, the accurate birthplace. So all those things need to be considered when you're deciding whether that is a true duplicate or not. So this kind of is intended to set the stage for part two. And in part two, which we will look at next time, we will look in a lot more detail about how to tell if whether two records really represent the same person. So I just wanted to point out that the possible duplicates function isn't magic, and it isn't a guarantee that it's really a possible duplicate. It really is a valuable tool for getting things right in Family Tree. So by way of summary, we talked about duplicates in Family Tree, what they are, why they are so many, and why they're a problem. We went through automated and manual methods of finding possible duplicates, and then we also gave two examples of how you can tell if two possible duplicates really are duplicates. But this is really meant to be a teaser for the next webinar, part two, which will be in about a few weeks on July 1st, as I recall. And then, of course, if you're watching this recording and it's after July 1st, just search for the second part and you'll be able to find it. So in part two, we're going to look at how to determine if two records, I've kind of said that a lot, haven't I? So we're going to look at how to determine if two records really are duplicates. So we're going to go into more detail on that, a demo of merging a duplicate, excuse me, and then also how to fix an incorrect merge. So that brings us to the end of this webinar today. And Bryant, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Kathryn. It looks like our first question is from Terrell, and it says, how about find similar people button for finding duplicates?
Oh, that Terrell, thank you for bringing that up. I have to acknowledge that I haven't used that very much because it kept finding the person I was already on. And I thought, this doesn't actually do quite as good a job of possible duplicates, so I've just been using that. If anybody else has a different experience, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. And the next question's from Eileen. It says, is there a way to decode the PIDs?
Oh, Eileen, that's such a good question. People always wonder about that. The truth is that FamilySearch just assigns these arbitrarily, but it's not completely arbitrary in that they go in a sort of systematic order. So any PID is not going to mean anything. Like, for instance, a one that starts with L doesn't mean a marriage, and a one that starts with D doesn't mean a christening. But since they were assigned sequentially, you can kind of tell from a PID when a record was added to the system. And I actually have a slide on that in another presentation, and I could uh, post a link to that on the YouTube video if you would like. The challenge that we run into is people want to equate it with life events, and it's never going to equate to that. But just off the top of my head, I can tell you that nines and M's are generally from the extraction program. K's are very often from Church of Jesus Christ membership records. L's are sometimes from extraction and a lot of times from New Family Search. They represent names that were added in New Family Search. And G's started to be used. And when I say G's and L's, I meant they start with that. You probably figured that out, but just to be clear on that. So PIDs that start with G's, as I recall, they started to be used in October 2018. So anytime you see a G, you will know that the name was added since then, and that it was most likely contributed by a user. So that's a quick summary, but again, I can post that slide to the comments on the YouTube video. Thank you for asking that. M. Lowe asks, if we are uncertain that it's a correct merge, should we mark not a duplicate or leave it for another person to determine? That is such a good question. I don't know if my experience is typical, but I run into bad merges pretty frequently, and they can take hours to fix. So for that reason, I feel that it's better not to do a merge unless you're absolutely sure that the two records are duplicates. On the other hand, you also don't want to mark it not a match unless you're certain it's really not a match. If you don't do the merge right away but think you might in the future after finding more information, it may be a good idea to put some notes on the collaboration tab for other users. Let them know what you figured out so far and what questions you still have. You could even consider putting something in the life sketch at the top of the person page because people are more likely to see that. So sometimes with some more research, you can determine if the merge should be done or not. And if you don't feel confident doing that yourself, don't hesitate to get help from a consultant or someone else. And then after you've resolved everything, you can either do the merge or mark the records not a match. I hope that's helpful.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we hope you have a great day.